y'all doing tonight? This is the Collins Brothers Unleashed. You have the ignorance, and then you have the all-consuming drama. Then you have the truth. And with that, to achieve it, you must turn to those who deliver it. I bid you and welcome you, the Collins Brothers Unleashed.
Hello, this is Paul and Philip Collins, welcoming you to another episode of the Collins Bros Unleashed. This week we are going to explore the secessionist movement and how the call for disunion is being used by the power elite to undermine national sovereignty and to introduce a new world order. As part of this episode, we will be referring to an article at the website www.wiseasserpents.com, an article that dismantles a piece that was written by Chuck Baldwin. So we really recommend that the listeners go to that site and look at that piece to kind of lay the groundwork for what we're going to go into tonight. But first, we'll take a critical look at some of the recent developments in the news. A recent Associated Press article by Barry Schweid entitled "Poll Isolationism Soars Among Americans" reveals just how unsuccessful the globalist power elite have been as of late in their attempts to condition the American public to reject national sovereignty and embrace the globalist concept of a one-world government. The December 3rd, 2009 article draws heavily from a poll conducted by the Pew Research Center. That poll, according to Schweid, found that a whopping 49% of Americans polled believe that America should, quote, mind its own business, unquote. Schweid informs us, quote, that's up 30% who said that in December 2002, unquote. Schweid also points out that the poll's findings, quote, appeared to conflict with President Barack Obama's activist foreign policy, including a newly announced buildup of 30,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan to fight Taliban and al-Qaeda extremists, unquote. According to Schweid, the poll shows the majority of Americans actually supporting the idea of a drawdown in Afghanistan. Schweid writes, quote, only 32% of the poll respondents favored increasing U.S. troops in Afghanistan, while 40% favored decreasing them, and fewer than half, or 46%, of those polled said it was somewhat or very likely that Afghanistan would be able to withstand the radicals' threats, unquote. Of course, the poll's results have drawn the attention of organizations that promote globalist ideas. One of those groups is the Council on Foreign Relations, an elite combine that is notorious for promoting globalist ideas. James N. Lindsay, the director of studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, felt a need to comment on the poll's results. Schweid elaborates, quote, it tells us that the president is sailing into a stiff wind, said James M. Lindsay, director of the studies at the private Council on Foreign Relations. Unless he can produce obvious successes in Afghanistan and generally, he will find himself challenged, Lindsay said. Nearly half the public worried the president is not tough enough in defending the interests of the United States generally, Lindsay said, unquote. This article basically illustrates just how prophetic the words of elitist H.G. Wells has become. In his 1933 book entitled The Shape of Things to Come, Wells sees globalization occurring in 3 cycles. The first 2 cycles, according to Wells, would end with a breakdown in the globalization process and the failure of the first 2 embryonic world governments, the League of Nations and the United Nations. But Wells was quick to assure his readers that the third and final cycle of globalization would be successful, and that an enlightened population would embrace the idea of a world government. 12 years later, however, Wells was not so optimistic. As he approached the end of his life, Wells began to see some of the many flaws that are inherent to the elite management of the world and realized that a world government was just not sustainable. Wells expressed his pessimism in his last book, the 1945 Mind at the End of Its Tethers. In that book, Wells wrote, quote, "Ours is a closed universe, yet we need something beyond it. Power is unsatisfactory," unquote. If power cannot provide salvation Wells seeks, then world government, which is the ultimate representation of worldly power, is most certainly unsatisfactory as a means of providing man with a worldly messiah. But the deluded power elite have conveniently ignored Wells' final words concerning the New World Order. They refuse to believe any assessment that holds that a New World Order is not sustainable. And that includes the words of their own thinkers, such as Wells. The elite are going to continue attempting to construct a New World Order, the warnings of failure notwithstanding. If they do not tread carefully, globalism could receive a fatal blow shortly after this century's first decade. And if that happens, there may not be a revival of the globalist idea until this century closes. Now, on to this week's topic. Well, as Paul previously mentioned, we'll be citing from a critique by a gentleman who maintains the website www.wiseasserpents.com. And I'd like to apologize to that gentleman in advance because I did not catch his name, nor could I find it. But at any rate, heretofore we'll just refer to him as the gentleman or the author of the website www.wiseasserpents.com. And on his website, he recently dismantled the claims of a Chuck Baldwin article entitled, "Is Obama Really Preparing for Civil War?" Now, for the record, we don't necessarily subscribe to or promote the work of the gentleman who maintains www.wiseasserpents.com. In some cases, this gentleman demonstrates a somewhat flawed understanding of deep politics and elite criminality. For instance, the gentleman occasionally portrays the global elite as monolithic, omnipotent, and unerring, a portrayal that is characteristic of sensationalism and conspiracy theory, and obviously even a precursory perusal of the literature over elite deviance does not support such a portrayal. The conspiracy is one of men, and as such exhibits all of the deficiencies and flaws inherent to the human condition. Now, that being said, the author of www.wiseasserpents.com does an absolutely outstanding job of dismantling the dubious claims of Baldwin's article, and for that, we tip our hats to the gentleman and say congratulations. Well, published on December 11th, Baldwin's article contends that President Barack Obama has ordered U.S. Air Force General Gene Renard to immediately enlarge his military forces to 1 million soldiers by January 30th, 2010, in anticipation of another American Civil War, an eventuality that supposedly should manifest before winter comes to a close. Now, in support of this claim, Baldwin consistently cites a report from the European Union Times. Yet, as the author of wiseasserpents.com makes clear, the European Union Times is not an actual newspaper. It is, in fact, a WordPress blog maintained by a female Florida resident. It is in no way affiliated with the European Union. And in turn, this blog links to American Resistance Radio, which is hosted by Jim Stackowiak. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, or Stackowiak. Stackowiak or Stackowiak. We'll go with Stackowiak. Stackowiak was the state director of the Georgia Civilian Militia from 1995 to 1997 as part of the National Confederation of Citizen Militias, or the NCCM, under Norman Olson. Many of the listeners will recognize Olson as the co-founder of the Michigan Militia. He co-founded that organization with Ray Southwell in 1994. However, this organization expelled Olson after the militia icon promoted a theory that the Oklahoma City bombing represented a violent reprisal by the Japanese government for the United States' alleged involvement in the March 20th, 1995 sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway. In truth, this attack was conducted by Om Shinrikyo, a Gnostic sect that was inspired by Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy. Parenthetically speaking, at this point, Olson has recently reemerged in Alaska, trying to whip up basically fervor for the militia movement, trying to get Alaskans to form into militia groups. He's obviously trying to use basically the secessionist fever that was begun by the Alaskan Independence Party to basically whip up fervor for the militia movements, to basically swell the membership roster of the militia movement. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but is that the same Alaskan Independence Party that was addressed by Sarah Palin? That's correct. And Sarah Palin's husband was actually a registered member of the AIP for a time as well. Now, the AIP, they do in fact promote the seceding of Alaska, the extrication of Alaska from the Union, correct? That's correct. Okay. And I believe that basically they had gone about creating that kind of a secessionist climate in Alaska among some of the population, certainly not all Alaskans. Sure. And Olson was basically trying to exploit that. Yeah, exploit that, capitalize on that atmosphere, that environment. As I understand it, heretofore he's not been very successful, though. No. But at any rate, Olson's theory was laughable, to say the least, given the fact that Om Shinrikyo was the party responsible for the sarin gas attacks on the Tokyo subway. Now, there have been some tenuous ties established between the cult of Om Shinrikyo and KGB operatives. However, that's material for an entirely separate show, the breadth and width of which is quite expansive indeed. Well, parenthetically speaking, also Olson, his whole weird theory concerning the OKC bombing and basically that attack representing some kind of reprisal for the sarin gas attacks, it's a neat little piece of disinformation that would actually lead people away from Om Shinrikyo's bizarre and actually quite interesting and important connections to the intelligence community and to criminalized portions of the intelligence community. And so Olson was very much acting as a disinformation unit, a disinformation agent, quite in the same way that 9/11 truth misfits find themselves acting as disinformation agents today. Was he a conscious agent of disinformation? Probably not. In all likelihood, these people disseminate the garbage that they do quite in spite of themselves, because they simply do not take the time to backtrack, to check their sources, to do any sort of real research, and they latch a hold of any rumor, any innuendo that circulates within the Patriot community, and immediately present it as the gospel truth. But the fact that Olson's disinformation would actually help divert people's attentions away from Om Shinrikyo and its connections to criminalized portions of the intelligence community tells us that somebody was feeding this information to Olson for some, for nefarious reasons. Absolutely. And Om Shinrikyo is a very interesting case study. We'll probably touch on Shinri Gill in later installments of the Collins Brothers Unleashed. And we touch briefly on them in the book, The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship, and we are also going to be writing a little bit more about them in our forthcoming book, Invoking and Beyond, which heretofore there is no release date for that. We've kind of stopped setting dates for the completion of that work because it's so massive, and we want to give it the time and the attention that it deserves. And so instead of setting up some sort of arbitrary date for completion, we've decided that we're just going to complete it when all the information is in and all of the arrangement and the construction of the book is to our satisfaction. At any rate, returning to this discussion, while it is by no means monolithic, the militia movement is composed of enclaves of radical thought. Militia members tend to adhere to questionable belief systems, such as British Israelism. We have already touched upon British Israelism in our unfolding series over mystical imperialism. Those episodes are still available, and we urge the listeners to check them out. Go back and listen to them to contextualize some of the information that we're presenting you with in this installment of the Collins Bros Unleashed. We will also be discussing mystical imperialism in later installments of the Collins Bros Unleashed. We have yet to touch on German mystical imperialism and Russian mystic imperialism. The topic is a very expansive one, and we want to finish examining it in great depth. But at any rate, in a nutshell, British Israelism holds that Queen Victoria was descended from the biblical King David, and therefore was a member of the Davidic lineage that begat Jesus Christ. And proponents of British Israelism contend that the tribes of Israel migrated to northern Europe and hold direct genealogical ties to the British. Thus, the British are actually God's chosen people, and the British Empire is the will of God being tangibly enacted on earth by the hand of man. So British Israelism qualifies as a form of Emanetist Gnosticism, as is evidenced by its mandate to draw the eschaton, that is, the end of days, into the ontological confines of the physical universe and establish heaven on earth, this time under the appellation of empire. According to researchers Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, John Dee, who served as a psychic spy in the court of Prague's Emperor Rudolph II, amalgamated the ideas of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, Francesco Zorzi, and Giordano Bruno to create a form of British Israelism that venerated Elizabeth I as a messiah. Dee boasted a background in astrology and alchemy and subscribed to a belief in an immanent apocalypse. Intimations of an immanent apocalypse are evident throughout the militia movement, as well as is evidenced by the millennial eschatology that pervades its literature. Raymond K. Payton's The Sundown at Coffin Rock and Jean Raspel's The Camp of the Saints are two cases in point. Inspired by such literature, many militia members prophesied an impending apocalypse with the federal government casted as the proverbial Satan. No doubt, belief in this Manichaean narrative predisposed several militia members to some form of proactive millennial violence, thereby providing the Justice Department with an expedient pretext for Operation Megiddo. The executive summary of Operation Megiddo states, quote, militias, adherents of racist belief systems such as Christian identity and Odinism, and other radical domestic extremists are clearly focusing on the millennium as a time of action. Certain individuals from these various perspectives are acquiring weapons, storing food and clothing, raising funds through fraudulent means, procuring safe houses, preparing compounds, surveying potential targets, and recruiting new converts. These and other indicators are not taking place in a vacuum, nor are they random or arbitrary. At the final analysis, while making specific predictions is extremely difficult, acts of violence in commemoration of the millennium are just as likely to occur as not, unquote. Now, of course, no proactive millennial violence occurred with the arrival of the year 2000. However, there was a climate of mutual suspicion between militia members and federal law enforcement. Such mutual suspicion is socially and politically expedient for the various factions of the global oligarchical establishment. Hostility between the federal government and violent nativist enclaves has a tendency to undermine constitutional governance as police state measures are promoted to maintain social order. Beset by radicalized populations, the already beleaguered federal government has little choice but to enact unconstitutional laws and violate civil liberties. This vicious circle stems from a mutual adherence to some form of millennial eschatology. Militia members viewed the year 2000 as the year that totalitarianism would be enshrined. For instance, one of the chief pseudo-researchers venerated by the militia movement, Anthony J. Hilder, stated on his video Millennium 2000 that by the year 2000 we would be enslaved. It's unavoidable. It will occur. Meanwhile, officials within the federal government viewed the year 2000 as the year of a violent uprising. There simply was no way to stem the tide of the inevitable uprising of militia members, and the federal government would have to prepare itself to meet that challenge by basically transmogrifying the constitutional government of America into a police state. So you have this vicious circle stemming from that millennial eschatology to which both officials of the federal government and members of the militia adhered. Parenthetically speaking, also at this point, there is another reason that the militia movement is useful to the power elite, and it's not just in creating pretext for police state measures. By feeding these groups stories, anti-government propaganda that conveniently leaves out the power elite, which is basically a group. The global oligarchical establishment is a multinational fraternity that exists above government by supranational institutions. By feeding disinformation to these groups that paints the government in a bad light and leaves out the influence of the power elite and leaves out basically the fact that governments are a mixed bag and only a certain portion of the government is actually the puppet of the power elite. These militias can actually be turned into the enforcement arm, into a kind of militarized enforcement arm for the power elite, unwittingly so. Unwittingly so, they can become shock troops for the power elite. And a historical precedent for this actually exists. In France, in revolutionary France, the Jacobins were able to use the sans-culottes, which were basically urban workers in France, as their enforcement arm, or shock troops, and they were able to use them to basically neutralize any opposition and all of their competitors. And we have the same kind of possibility with different portions of the militia movement here in the United States. Militia movements that are fed theories that bring all the evils back to national governments, and these theories never mention the influence that the power elite has on the governments, and so basically the government and the government alone is presented as the enemy and therefore must be overthrown. And thus we have these proclivities towards anti-government anarchistic activism because of the misplacement of guilt, the misallocation of criminality to national governments, which, as George Washington made clear, government is merely force. That it's a morally neutral force, but it's just merely nothing more than an impersonal force with no real moral compass except for that which is provided for it by those who govern. So it's very erroneous to say that government is the source of all ills, of all woes, when in fact some form of government is necessary to maintain social order, is necessary to protect the liberties of its citizenry. But in casting the government as the veritable Manichaean devil, the militia movement is actually serving the interest of the supranational elite, because the supranational elite wish to see the dissolution of all national governments so that they may be amalgamated into a single global government under their overarching authority. These short-sighted populist idiots that make up the militia movement never ask themselves what will fill the power vacuum following the overthrow of the governments, of national governments. And the truth of it is that an entity that is representative of the global oligarchical establishment, this virtual state, this virtual state made up of the hidden aristocracy, will basically take the place of national government. Could you define that term, virtual state, really quick, Paul? Virtual state basically comes from the CIA analyst Philip Bobbitt. To describe an entity, a hidden nation that has no geographic boundaries. It does not. There's no clear geographical demarcations for the state. There's no clear locus of power for the state. You couldn't point to it on a map. You couldn't pinpoint its capital. Its topography fluctuates, and it's really more so. It's more so just it's more. Is that the reason why it's called a virtual state? Because it's called a virtual state for that reason, but also because it has many. While it lacks geographical boundaries, it still has machinations and basically components that resemble a traditional state. It has its own military. It has its own retirement kind of plan. It has its own economy. And the global oligarchical establishment could be classified as a virtual state. And the global oligarchical establishment will come to rule when the power vacuum, if a power vacuum were to be created by the violent overthrow of national governments by the militias. Ominously enough, doesn't Bobbitt use the term virtual state in reference to terrorist organizations? That's correct. So that very ominous commonality is shared by the power elite and terrorism. In fact, that could be why you have individuals like bin Laden being connected so closely to those who occupy the halls of officialdom, higher government officials and what have you. I mean, the bin Laden family was actually quite a wealthy aristocratic family. Well, actually, the bin Laden family is part of the Saudi Arabian contingent of the global oligarchical family. This is, the 9/11 Truth Movement tries to portray this guy as just some kind of marginalized fanatic hiding out in a cave, but the truth of the matter is that he came from a very wealthy Saudi Arabian family that had a very successful contracting company tied to the Bush family, tied to the Carlyle Group, tied to several different defense contractors here in the United States. And so it's in an examination of bin Laden's background that one will find incriminating evidence leading to the actual power elite. That's correct. The family even receives legal advice from Sullivan and Cromwell, which is the most powerful Wall Street firm today. Yeah, so essentially all the talk of the melting point of steel and bombs in the building and what have you, that's really quite the smokescreen, isn't it?
That's correct.
But if you want to put the militia movement into the proper light, it's really wrong to see them as patriots. It's really wrong to see them as just a bunch of marginalized fanatics. It's probably the most accurate way of seeing them is as the sans-culotte of the power elite, of the
moderate Jacobins.
Yeah, the modern. They are the modern day sans-culotte, and the power elite are the modern day Jacobins, the militia movement is probably not aware in any way, shape, or form that they're being used in this manner.
Well, sadly enough, and I know how this sounds, but I don't think that any of them have the aptitude or the intellectual prowess to discern that.
Well, we'll see if that proves to be true with the response to this particular program.
Right, absolutely. Well, before we proceed any further, we'd like to at this moment thank our sponsors, Suke Koji's Martial Arts and Ninja Gear. Suke Koji's Martial Arts and Ninja Gear offers the finest selection of martial arts equipment, from broadswords to grappling hooks to uniforms, instructional books, cassettes, and tapes. Suke Koji's Martial Arts and Ninja Gear offers all of the finest products for your martial arts needs, and we thank Suke Koji for his gracious sponsorship. We'd also like to, at this moment, take the time to thank Bert Mills, who is the producer of our show and provides us with this platform. Bert Mills is just an outstanding individual, and his contribution to disseminating this information is absolutely invaluable. We can't thank Bert enough. We owe him a debt of gratitude that hopefully one day we'll fully repay. We'd also like at this moment to let listeners know about our book, The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship, an examination of epistemic autocracy from the 19th to the 21st century. You can find a copy of it at Amazon.com. You just enter the title in the search engine, and you should be taken directly to the official page for the book. You want the 2006 Book Search edition, not the 2003 iUniverse edition. The 2006 Book Search edition is expanded and revised and has twice the information and brand new pieces of information as well. And several of the predictions that were made in that book are actually coming to pass. So you might want to check out The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship. You can also check out some of our writings on the World Wide Web at Terry Melanson's outstanding Conspiracy Archive website. That's at www.conspiracyarchive.com. Simply go there, click on the commentators link. A list of the contributing authors will come up. You'll see Paul and my name there, and you simply click on that link, and you'll be taken to the most comprehensive collection of all of our articles on the World Wide Web. And we are very grateful to Terry for supplying us with that platform. Terry's a great friend. Terry, of course, authored the outstanding book Perfectibilis, the 18th century order of the Illuminati. This book is the quintessential book on the Illuminati. It dispels all of the myths, completely, totally dismantles all of the conspiracy theories, and sticks to nothing more than pure 100% historical fact. There is no better book on the Bavarian Illuminati than Perfectibilis, and we highly recommend that the listeners check out that book as well. Well, returning to our conversation, as we mentioned earlier, this vicious circle of mutual suspicion between the militia and the militia movement and the federal government stems from a mutual adherence to some form of millennial eschatology. Fraudulent eschatology is promulgating a similar climate of mutual suspicion today. The year 2012
has been imbued with mystical significance by several pseudo-researchers venerated by the 9/11 truth movement, such as David Icke and Michael Tsarian. The eschatological sensationalism of director Roland Emmerich's film has only reaffirmed the apocalyptic presuppositions of many 9/11 truth adherents. Confrontations between 9/11 truthers and law enforcement are becoming increasingly common. One of the leading instigators of this belligerence towards law enforcement is 9/11 truther and conspiracy profiteer Alex Jones. Meanwhile, law enforcement's response to the truth movement's antics is becoming increasingly incendiary as both the truth movement and the federal government continue to follow this escalatory trajectory. Violence becomes more and more likely. Such violence would supply the pretext for the implementation of police state measures. Another questionable belief system to which many militia members adhere is neo-Confederate secessionism, which promotes the extrication of the southern states and territories from the Union. The advocacy of such disunity sets into motion a domino effect where states continue to fragment themselves until the republic is completely atomized. James Buchanan warned of just such a state of affairs in his 1860 State of the Union address, where he said, quote, "In order to justify secession as a constitutional remedy, it must be on the principle that the federal government is a mere voluntary association of states to be dissolved at pleasure by any one of the contracting parties. If this be so, the Confederacy is a rope of sand to be penetrated and dissolved by the first adverse wave of public opinion in any of the states. In this manner, our 33 states may resolve themselves into as many petty, jarring, and hostile republics, each one retiring from the Union without responsibility whenever any sudden excitement might impel them to such a course. By this process, a Union might be entirely broken into fragments in a few weeks, which cost our forefathers many years of toil, privation, and blood to establish," unquote. Such a state of affairs is a necessary precursor to regionalism, which is really a strategy for undermining sovereign states and amalgamating them into a form of global governance. In the article entitled Regionalism and Nationalism, author N.S.B. Gross wrote, quote, "The direct effect of regionalism may be to make the state weaker politically but stronger economically and socially, or the region, looking to regional convenience, may make new alignments leading to the creation of new states or to international states, European, American, and so on, or ultimately to a world state," unquote. So there we have again the theme of constant fragmentation and atomization of nation states to the point where they become little more than provinces that can be amalgamated under an overarching global government. In his book, Geoeconomic Regionalism and World Federalism, Maurice Parmelli was even more blunt in pointing out how regionalism erodes national sovereignty. Parmelli stated, quote, "There can be no permanent peace so long as each nation retains its sovereignty. There can be no effective world organization to solve the economic and social problems of mankind so long as the nation is the unit of organization. The region, limiting national sovereignty and furnishing a suitable unit of organization for a world federation, is a practicable solution," unquote. So here we have Parmelli promoting the region regionalization as a means of actually limiting national sovereignty. Now, whether he realizes it or not, the neo-Confederate facilitates regionalism. And not surprisingly, Chuck Baldwin himself harbors neo-Confederate propensities. Baldwin has written the following, quote, "I believe the South was right in the war between the states, and I am not a racist, and I invite anyone to ask any of the numerous members of minority races that attend my church to verify that. Neither do I believe that the leaders of the old Confederacy were racist. In fact, I hold such men as General Robert E. Lee and General T.J. Stonewall Jackson in the highest regard," unquote. No doubt, Baldwin's neo-Confederate propensities constituted a major motivating factor in the writing of his article, Is Obama Really Preparing for Civil War? Evidently, Baldwin believes that another secession from the Union is justified and need not be associated with racist ideologies. However, Baldwin has not done his homework. Confederate apologists attempt to divorce secessionism from racism, arguing that the Civil War was actually fought over states' rights. Southern secession documents clearly show that the Confederacy's main goal was the formation of slave-holding fiefdoms. John Motley, the U.S. Minister to Austria, correctly identified the Confederacy as a conspiracy to splinter the United States in an 1861 letter to the London Times. The letter further stated that the Confederate balkanization project would lead to the establishment of, quote, a great Gulf empire, including Mexico, Central America, Cuba, and other islands with unlimited cotton fields and unlimited Negroes. This is the golden vision in pursuit of which the great republic has been sacrificed, the beneficent Constitution subverted, unquote.
Parenthetically speaking, right here at this juncture, notice the arrangement that was described by Motley. It sounds ominously like the trade block that was basically planned under NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Right, and it's in a sense the Confederacy, the old Confederacy, was committed to its own variety of free trade at the time. Motley's view, though, of the war as a conspiracy hatched by the slaveholding aristocracy of the South was widely accepted in the years following the 1861 to 1865 conflict. From 1865 to 1872, according to semiotician William Pincack, only 3 scholarly works used the term Civil War. Alfred H. Guernsey's and Henry M. Alden's Harper's Pictorial History of the Civil War, which was put out in 1867, Vincent J. Losing's Pictorial History of the Civil War in the United States, which ran from 1866 to 1868, and John W. Draper's History of the Civil War in America, which ran from 1887 to 1870. 18 other books during the same period referred to the conflict as the Rebellion, the War of the Rebellion, the Great War of the Rebellion, Great Southern Rebellion, and American Rebellion. These historical texts reiterated the overall theme of Abraham Lincoln's July 4th, 1861 speech. In that speech, Lincoln classified the secession as a rebellion, thus rejecting any notion of legitimacy or legality on the part of the Confederacy. Confederate revisionists preferred the term Civil War because it implied that both parties were equal in legality and legitimacy. According to Pincack, Southerners also preferred the term war between the states because it implied, quote, instead of being a struggle for mastery between 2 units within the same sovereign state, 2 sovereign states or collections thereof were fighting war, and that one of the parties was trying to violate the legitimate rights of the other by denying its independence, unquote. The Confederacy was neither sovereign nor independent. The southern states were part of a larger nation that was being ripped apart by a slave power conspiracy that wanted to basically subsume the whole nation under their slaveholding fiefdoms. Furthermore, the terms Civil War and war between the states also implied that the war was not premised upon slavery, upon the issue of slavery, but was premised upon the issue of states' rights instead. What is often ignored, however, is the fact that the Confederacy was only interested in the issue of states' rights and sovereignty insofar as it related to slavery. Southern apologists have claimed that slavery was a, quote, benevolent and civilizing institution which only became an issue as Northerners began to threaten it, unquote. However, this begs an important question. If slavery was an inherently good institution, why not fight for it rather than states' rights? States' rights and sovereignty were merely pretexts for secession and the establishment of slave-holding fiefdoms, euphemistically referred to as Confederate republics. The violence and corruption of the Reconstruction era led to a weakening of the moral authority and the role of the Republican Party by the mid-1860s. 1870s scandals during the Grant presidency resulted in a union between liberal Republicans and conservative Southern Democrats that wished to see Horace Greeley win his 1872 bid for the White House. In 1877, Republican President Rutherford B. Hayes was able to get the Democrats to accept his questionable election victory by pulling the remaining federal troops out of the South, allowing white Southerners to engage in domestic terrorism against the disenfranchised blacks with little or no oppositions. While it was in this political and social climate that a softer, gentler, and kinder portrait of the Confederacy began to emerge. As a climate of terminological diversity arose, the terms Civil War and war between the states began gaining ground. Resistance began to rise against the use of the term rebellion because it implied that the Confederacy was illegal, illegitimate, and even treasonous insurgency. One of those who refused to recognize the Confederacy's traitorous nature was ex-Confederate President Jefferson Davis. In his 1881 history entitled The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Davis wrote that he, quote, heartily repudiated and condemned, calling the war the rebellion, unquote. And Confederate rebellions, Davis wrote, the term rebels being ascribed to Confederates. Davis wrote, quote, a sovereign cannot rebel and sovereign states cannot be in rebellion, unquote. In the 1890s, two Confederates used the term Civil War for the first time. One book was authored by an obscure Missourian, and the second book was entitled From Manassas to Appomattox, Memoirs of the Civil War Era, was written by ex-Confederate General James A. Longstreet. According to Pintack, the term Civil War took, quote, a decisive lead in the nomenclature sweepstakes, unquote, during the decade from 1901 to 1911. State Commander John M. Woods recognized the revisionism for what it really was. And in a 1915 speech to the Grand Army of the Republic of Massachusetts, Woods stated that, quote, the men and papers that shape public opinion in the South, and the women as well, are leaving no stone unturned to blot out the words civil and rebellion in all official papers, school books, and histories relating to the War of 1861 to 1865, and call it officially the war between the states, unquote. According to Woods, the Southern social engineers were actually lying, misleading people about the issue of states' rights, and were intentionally ignoring the fact that, quote-unquote, human slavery was the cause. Woods further stated, quote, no fair historian can find the slightest justification for secession and treason. The just penalty of the latter is death, unquote. Thus, Southern apologists are guilty of semiotic deception. By deliberately altering crucial pieces of terminology, Southern apologists were able to rehabilitate the otherwise unsavory image of the Confederacy. With its oligarchic character semiotically veiled by intentionally misleading terminology and euphemistic rhetoric, the slaveholding South was virtually canonized. Pintack elaborates, quote, in the long run, the South had not only won the right to control its own racial affairs, it also triumphed in the popular imagination as fighting a legitimate and heroic cause. Much of this ideological triumph persists despite the limited victories of the civil rights movement. Robert E. Lee is a national hero. Streets and babies are named after him, as they are not, for instance, after Benedict Arnold, and rebel flags still fly high, unquote. In reality, the Confederacy and slavery were inextricably linked. In its declaration of the immediate causes which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina from the Federal Union, South Carolina, the first state to secede, stated, quote, an increasing hostility on the part of the non-slaveholding, that is to say, northern states, of this institution of slavery has led to a disregard of their obligations. They have denounced as sinful the institution of slavery. They have encouraged and assisted thousands of our slaves to leave their homes through the Underground Railroad. A geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states north of that line have united in the election of a man to the high office President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, that is, whose opinions and purposes are hostile towards slavery. He is to be entrusted with the administration of the common government because he has declared himself that government cannot endure permanently, half slave, half free, and that the public mind must rest in the belief that slavery is in the course of ultimate extinction. The slaveholding states will no longer have the power of self-government or self-protection over the issue of slavery, unquote. So there we see quite transparently that South Carolina was extricating itself from the Union, not because of states' rights, but because of the issue of slavery and because their perceived state right to such an institution. After seceding, South Carolina called upon its fellow southern states to join in the secession, and in its address of South Carolina to slaveholding states, the state explained why it was seceding and said, quote, "We are dissolving a union with non-slaveholding Confederates and seeking a confederation with slaveholding states. Experience has proved that slaveholding states cannot be safe in subjection to non-slaveholding states. The people of the North have not left us in doubt as to their designs and policy. United as a section in the late presidential election, they have elected as the exponent of their policy one Abraham Lincoln, who has openly declared that all states of the United States must be made free states or slave states. In spite of all disclaimers and professions, that is to say, measures such as the Corrin Amendment, written to assure that the southern states that Congress would not abolish slavery, there can be but one end by the submission by the South to the rule of a sectional anti-slavery government at Washington, and that end, directly or indirectly, must be the emancipation of the slaves of the South. The people of the non-slaveholding North are not and cannot be safe associates of the slaveholding South under a common government, citizens of the slaveholding states of the United States," unquote. Mississippi also joined South Carolina in its rebellion on January 9th, 1861. And in a declaration of the immediate causes which induced and justified the secession of the state of Mississippi from the federal union, Mississippi declared, quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has been long aimed at the institution and was at the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left to us but submission to the mandates of abolition or a dissolution of the Union, whose principles had been subverted to work out our ruin. That we do not overstate the dangers to our institutions, that is slavery. A reference to a few facts will sufficiently prove. The hostility to this institution commenced before the adoption of the Constitution and was manifested in the well-known ordinance of 1787. On July 13th, 1787, when the nation still governed itself under the Articles of Confederation, the Continental Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance, which Mississippi here calls the well-known Ordinance of 1787. Now, that ordinance set forth provisions whereby the Northwest Territories could become states in the United States, and eventually the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota were formed from that territory. As a requirement for statehood and entry into the United States, Article 6 of that ordinance stipulated there shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory. When the Constitution replaced the Articles of Confederation, the Founding Fathers repassed the Northwest Ordinance to ensure its continued effectiveness under the new Constitution. As more territory was gradually ceded to the United States, the Southern Territories, Mississippi and Alabama, the Missouri Territory, Missouri and Arkansas, etc., Congress applied the requirements of the ordinance to those new territories. Mississippi had originally entered the United States under the requirement that it not allow slavery, and it is here objecting not only to that requirement of its own admission to the United States, but also to that requirement for the admission of other states. It has grown until it denies the right of property in slaves and refuses protection to that right on the high seas. Congress banned the importation of slaves into America in 1808. In the territories, in the Northwest Ordinance of 1789, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1954. And wherever the government of the United States had jurisdiction, it advocates Negro equality socially and politically. We must either submit to degradation and to the loss of property, i.e. slaves, worth $4 billion of money, or we must secede from the Union framed by our fathers to secure this as well as every other species of property, unquote. Now, at the Virginia Secession Convention, Mississippi's delegate Fulton Anderson announced that Mississippi had unanimously approved a document, quote, setting forth the grievance of the Southern people on the slavery question, unquote. The third state to secede, Florida, also emphasized slavery as the driving force behind secession. In the January 7, 1861 preliminary resolution prior to secession, Florida's Confederates stated, quote, all hope of preserving this union upon terms consistent with the safety and honor of the slaveholding states has been finally dissipated by the recent indications of the strength of the anti-slavery sentiment in the free states, unquote. Alabama joined the rebellion on January 11, 1861. In an ordinance to dissolve the union between the state of Alabama and the other states united under the compact styled the Constitution of the United States, Alabama denounced, quote, the election of Abraham Lincoln and Hannibal Hamlin to the offices of President and Vice President of the United States by a sectional party, the Republicans, avowedly hostile to the domestic institutions, slavery, and to the peace and security of the people of the state of Alabama, unquote. In a declaration of the causes which impelled the state of Georgia to secede from the federal union, January 29, 1861, Georgia pointed to the anti-slavery stance of Lincoln and the Republicans as a major motivation for secession. The declaration stated, quote, a brief history of the rise, progress, and policy of anti-slavery and the political organization into whose hands the administration of the federal government has been committed, i.e. the Republican Party, will justify the pronounced verdict of the people of Georgia in favor of secession. The party of Lincoln, called the Republican Party under its present name and organization, is of recent origin. It is admitted to be an anti-slavery party. The prohibition of slavery in the territories, hostility to it everywhere, the equality of the black and white races, disregard of all constitutional guarantees in its favor were boldly proclaimed by its Republican leaders and applauded by its followers. The abolitionists and their allies in the northern states have been engaged in constant efforts to subvert our institutions, i.e. slavery. So as these excerpts make clear, the cause of secessionism in the South cannot be divorced from the racist motives that birthed it. While Baldwin claims that he's not a racist, support of the South constitutes support for the Southern vision of a collection of slaveholding fiefdoms. Not surprisingly, racist themes pervade the literature of militia movement of the various factions of the militia movement. For instance, the book by Raspel again, the Camp of Saints, it
provides a perfect example. The book's narrative involves, quote, an invasion of the white Western world by a fleet of starving, dark-skinned refugees, unquote. The Camp of Saints was a major inspiration for John Tanton, a population control advocate, radical environmentalist, and the founder and financier of 13 immigration restriction organizations. Paul and I discuss him at length in the book, The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship. Among one of the organizations that were founded and or financed by Tanton is the Federation for American Immigration Reform, or FAIR, which received funding from the Pioneer Fund. The Pioneer Fund finds its proximate origins with Wycliffe Draper. Draper was born in Massachusetts in 1891, the product of a mixture of old Kentucky and Puritan blood. Draper was convinced that his family tree constituted a superior stock of humanity and that it should be considered the true Americans. In the 1920s, Draper inherited a multi-million-dollar textile fortune. After attending the Nazis' International Congress for the Scientific Investigation of Population Problems in 1935 in Berlin, Draper decided to devote a very large portion of his fortune to eugenics and race science. It would be no exaggeration to say that Draper was drawing his inspiration from mass murderers. Wilhelm Frick, a World War criminal convicted during the Nuremberg trials, was the honorary chairman at the 1935 meeting that Draper attended in Berlin. In 1937, Draper joined forces with the eugenicist Harry Laughlin and the eugenicist Frederick Osborne to form the Pioneer Fund. The fund helped the crusade for nationwide eugenical regimentation through the distribution of grants, and in its first year, the Pioneer Fund had in its budget 2 German films promoting the theme of eugenics. One of those films, titled The Hereditary Defective, was shown at 28 high schools throughout the United States thanks to the efforts of Harry Laughlin. Draper's money was also used to print a special edition of Ernest Sevier Cox's White America. The racist tract was distributed to every member of the 1937 Congress. So for Draper, race betterment really meant the disenfranchisement of blacks. For one of the white supremacist academics that Draper recruited to his cause was the segregationist and chair of psychology at Columbia University, Henry Garrett. Garrett served as a witness supporting segregation in the 1952 Davis versus County School Board court case. And Davis versus County School Board became part of a much larger historic case, Brown versus the Board of Education. In 1964, the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission used $215,000 given to it by Draper in an attempt to prevent the Civil Rights Act from passing. In 1977, North Iowa professor Dr. Ralph Scott used Pioneer Fund money to finance anti-busing, anti-school integration seminars. Also, the Pioneer group that was the Pioneer Fund that was founded by Draper ties into the secessionist movement through Jesse Helms' political machine. Part of Jesse Helms' political machine was an individual named Carter Wren. Carter Wren helped actually manage the 1972 U.S. Senate campaign of Jesse Helms, and Carter Wren had a law partner by the name of Hines. His first name was I'm trying to find it here. Richard T. Hines. Rich Paul, is that Hines of Heinz Ketchup? No. This is Hines spelled Hines.
Richard T. Hines was a lobbyist who was a law partner with, a business partner with Carter Wren. Hines is a fundraiser, was a fundraiser and a donor for the Southern Legal Resource Center in Black Mountain, North Carolina. And when high school student Jacqueline Duty was banned from her senior prom in 2003 for wearing a Confederate Flag sequin dress, it was the Southern Legal Resource Center that took her on as a client, and Hines underwrote her case with a donation of $1,000. In August of 2005, Hines donated an additional $1,000 to the Southern Legal Resource Center's General Fund. The Southern Legal Resource Center seems to be a sponsor for several different terrorists with actually ties to government sponsorship. The Southern Legal Resource Center was founded by Kurt Lyons, the white supremacist lawyer who successfully represented Louis Beam, and Louis Beam was basically brought up on charges of sedition. He was plotting to overthrow the government, and he was trying to establish an all-white nation in the Pacific Northwest. We'll have more over Beam in this presentation a little while later on. But according to investigative journalist Ambrose Evans Pritchard, Lyons was responsible for introducing Andreas Strassmeyer, a former German infantry officer whose father was a respected member of the Christian Democratic Party, to Elohim City. Now, Elohim City was the paramilitary headquarters of the neo-Nazi movement in eastern Oklahoma, and of course headed by Reverend Millar, who of course has been tied to federal law enforcement. Yeah, it would be later revealed in the Tulsa courtroom that Robert Millar was an FBI informant, and we know that the ATF were going to conduct a raid on Elohim City based on information that they had received from their informant Carol Howe, who was an ATF basically working for the ATF in Elohim City. She gave information to the ATF, basically pointing towards Strassmeyer and Aryan Nation member Dennis Mahan, planning a series of bombings that included the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. That raid may have prevented the Oklahoma City bombing, but Agent Angela Finley, who was Howe's handler in the ATF, was informed by the Oklahoma Highway Patrol that the raid could not be conducted because the, quote, FBI also had an ongoing investigation on Elohim City, unquote. So as you can see, Hines is connected through Lyons and through the Southern Legal Resource Center to some possible state-sponsored terrorist with ties in the neo-Confederate community, in the secessionist community, in the white supremacist community, and this ties right back into the Pioneer Fund that you were talking about there earlier. As I previously stated, the Pioneer Fund was a major source of funding for FAIR, and not surprisingly, the statistical data produced by FAIR is often cited by anti-immigration columnist Frosty Waldridge, whose work frequently appears at the anti-Semitic website of Jeff Rense. Rense is also a proponent of many 9/11 truth conspiracy theories, which often seek to incriminate Israel as the sole perpetrator of the WTC attacks. Now, as I have made clear in previous installments of the Collins Brothers Unleashed, the cause of eugenics qualifies as an a form of Humanitist Gnosticism because of its emphasis upon externalities as the source of evil. This emphasis stems from traditional Gnosticism's rejection of the doctrine of original sin. For the traditional Gnostic, the ontological confines of the physical universe are inherently evil because they separate the pneuma of man from the divine pneuma. Thus, humanity finds itself in a perpetual state of alienation. You'll recognize that theme of alienation reiterated ad nauseum by later Humanitist Gnostics such as Karl Marx, who himself, many have postulated, was a self-loathing Jew or a Hofjuden, a Jew who actually hated other Jews, as is evidenced by his book, A World Without Jews. Quite an odd, idiosyncratic belief system, but nevertheless very much prevalent today, as is evidenced by other Hofjudens such as Noam Chomsky, whose anti-Israeli rhetoric is just replete with virulent racism and Arabist proclivities. We also have the case of Otto von Bolschevik, the Nazi, actually being involved in the creation of the more fascist portions of the Zionist movement. So again, we have this kind of strange, bizarre confluence that exists in this world above the traditional partisan affiliations. This world where ideology ends up being more of just a camouflage, right? That world where Michael Harari and Rafi Eitan, two Mossad agents, actually can work with the Butcher of Leon, Nazi Klaus Barbie. Absolutely, very, very odd confluences. But nevertheless, the Humanitist Gnostic seeks to redeem history by altering the externalities that allegedly corrupted. For the adherents of Hitler's Aryanism, the corrupting externality was dysgenics, stemming from miscegenation, from the mixing of races. And of course, Hitler's Aryanism was a redemptive interpretation of history, which is symptomatic of Humanitist Gnosticism, because he viewed the Nazi Party as a crusade to redeem humanity from the racial degradation that it had suffered since it engaged in miscegenation. So we have that redemptive interpretation of history that is characteristic of Humanitist Gnosticism. Well, not surprisingly, the author of www.wisehasserpents.com traces the article, quote, Obama orders 1 million U.S. troops to prepare for civil war, unquote, to a Gnostic mystic named Sorja Fowl. One of the texts offered by Fowl on her website is The Aryan Symbols of Hope. Apparently the book was authored by a sister, Sonam Tashi, with the sanction of the Dalai Lama. Of course, the book contends that the Nazis corrupted the Aryan symbols for political gains. However, numerous researchers have noted the fascist overtones of the Dalai Lama sect, thereby rendering such disavowals of Hitlerian Aryanism as disingenuous. I would point the audience to one particular researcher by the name of Dave Emery, who has done an excellent job in examining the fascist overtones of the Dalai Lama's sect. Well, in the grand tradition of Gnostic Jehovah bashing, Fowl promotes a book by David Booth entitled Dirty, Filthy Christians, Treatise on the Most Dangerous Death Cult in Human History, unquote. Such fiery anti-Christian rhetoric echoes the words of Friedrich Nietzsche, whose Immanent philosophy was a major influence on Hitler. And of course, Nietzsche believed that the only way to expunge the priestly caste of Christianity was to strike at its root, which would be what he called that nation of priests, the Jews. Of course, many people have claimed that Nietzsche's sister, who was an anti-Semite, had majorly misinterpreted Nietzsche's work and presented it as support for her anti-Semitic contentions. Nevertheless, Nietzsche's work certainly does not lend itself to any real defense of the Jew. And all ideas have their consequences, and when you have this virulent hatred for what he called the priestly caste, then one must suppose that includes just about all religious sects, including Judaism. So evidently these attempts to divorce Nietzscheism from Nazism are not quite as salient as one might believe. Now, as we pointed out earlier, one of the many websites that reposted the article entitled "Obama Orders 1 Million U.S. Troops to Prepare for Civil War" was American Resistance Radio, home of Jim Statuayak, a prominent figure in the militia movement. Statuayak is a mover and shaker in the American resistance movement, a portion of the militia movement that subscribes to the idea of leaderless revolution. The American resistance movement's adherence to the concept of leaderless resistance is important because it points to the influence of criminalized portions of the intelligence community on the so-called Patriot movement. That is, the Patriot movement, of course, is experiencing a resurgence in the United States, especially with the advent of the Obama administration. And unfortunately, it's largely the Obama's own fault for this resurgence. He has chosen as his economic team people totally made up of Wall Street operatives. The majority of his administration comes from the old line establishment. So basically, he's basically created the pretext, whether he realizes it or not, for this resurgence of the Patriot militia movement here in the United States. But as I stated, the American resistance movement basically adheres to the concept of leaderless resistance, and the leaderless resistance concept was resurrected during the early 90s by white supremacist Louis Beam in his publication, appropriately named, I might say, The Seditionist. The concept, however, is not the product of Louis Beam. It's not his own product. It's not an original idea coming from Louis Beam's head, as I imagine many of his ideas are not. Many ideas are coming from Louis Beam's head or anything but original. In the February 1992 issue of The Seditionist, Beam shared the origins of the leaderless resistance concept. Beam wrote, quote, "The concept of leaderless resistance was prepared by Colonel Julius Lewis Amos, who was the founder of International Service of Information Incorporated, located in Baltimore, Maryland. Colonel Amos died more than 15 years ago, but during his life was a tireless opponent of communism, as well as a skilled intelligence officer. Colonel Amos first wrote of leaderless resistance on April 17, 1962, unquote. According to the University of Oregon Library's Subject Guide to Conservative and Libertarian Material, Julius L. Amos was, quote, dedicated to a career in espionage, unquote. Amos worked with the International Committee of the YMCA in Greece, which is interesting because CIA defector Philip Agee seems to imply in his book, Inside the Company, that the YMCA was actually a conduit for the CIA. Amos also formed the International Services of Information Foundation, incorporated in 1946, which is described as, quote, a non-profit, privately owned and operated intelligence service whose purpose was to collect and disseminate information from overseas countries, unquote. Private intelligence groups are, of course, extremely useful to criminal elements in the intelligence community because they are not subject to congressional oversight. The International Services of Information, in fact, acted as a CIA commercial cover operation. Amos also held an important position in the Office of Strategic Services, which is the precursor to the CIA. Declassified information concerning Amos reveals that he was, quote, recruited, Declassified information concerning Amos reveals that he, quote, recruited, trained, and launched numerous teams of assassins that carried out hits on various targets all over North Africa, Southern Europe, Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal, unquote. All these assassination attempts were carried out while Amos was chief of station in Cairo, Egypt. While it was claimed that William Donovan had officially fired Amos, he was unofficially kept on with the OSS. He was on the OSS payroll, and he continued to work for the OSS. As an undercover operative, he worked in an undercover capacity. After World War II, Amos went to work for Frank Wisner, the director of the Office of Policy Coordination. The Office of Policy Coordination, or OPC, was the espionage and counterintelligence branch of the CIA. Several nefarious and sinister plans were hatched in this section of the CIA. Now, some of those plans included Operation Mockingbird, which was a program to basically transform American media organs into propaganda outlets for the CIA. It was an attempt by the CIA to actually control America's media outlets. And another program was Operation Bloodstone, a program which recruited several Nazis for use in the covert war against the American power elite's primary competitors, the Soviet Union. Needless to say, the Office of Policy Coordination's questionable activities drew heat from national security and law enforcement organs. Even J. Edgar Hoover referred to the OPC as, quote, Wisner's gang of weirdos, unquote. And Hoover began investigating this particular CIA branch. And this led to attacks from Joe McCarthy, who received information from Hoover concerning the OPC. And Hoover also fed McCarthy information concerning an affair that Wisner had with Princess Karaja of Romania during World War II. Hoover believed Princess Karaja to be a Soviet agent or a communist agent of some sort. And McCarthy then went on to basically investigate the OPC and investigate the CIA, and told Dulles privately that, quote, CIA was neither sacrosanct nor immune from investigation, unquote. And at this point it was basically decided that the senator's attempts at scrutiny had to be neutralized. So Dulles turned to James Angleton, who was the counterintelligence chief at the CIA, to accomplish this neutralization. Angleton used one of Wisner's first hires, James McCarter, to pass disinformation to McCarthy and his staff that would then later be used to discredit the senator's investigations. This effort prevented McCarthy from destroying Wisner's enclave at the CIA. This is the milieu that Julius Louis Amos inhabited, and it's from whence he quite possibly drew the inspiration for his writings over the leaderless resistance concept. Now, the concept is basically presented as an alternative to the leadership structure in underground movements, Leaderless resistance calls for political activism that is autonomous and built around ideology as opposed to some charismatic leader. In the case of Louis Beam and Jim Stachowicz and the countless misfits that populate the militia and Patriot milieu, the organizing ideology is a geopolitical eschatological myth that holds that secession is basically a romantic and patriotic act that is supposed to be instead of sedition a resistance to tyranny. It's basically held as being synonymous with Thomas Jefferson's ideas of resistance to tyranny. Here the invocation of the term myth is by no means to be associated with myth in the transcendent or traditional sense. Instead, it's to be associated with the Sorrellian myth, the social myth as it was conceived by George Sorel. And the social myth, according to George Sorel, basically conjures up an image of a potential future within the minds of those exposed to the myth. And in many instances, such as the case of Marxism and other variants of socialism, the image evoked is by the social myth is utopian in character. And this shared vision gains imaginative momentum amongst true believers and eventually witnesses tangible enactment through social and or political activism. Sorel elaborates on the social myth's migration from imaginative abstraction to tangible enactment when he wrote, quote, "The men who participate in the great social movements represent to themselves their subsequent actions under the guise of images of battles which assure them the success of their endeavor. I propose the name myths for these constructions. The knowledge thereof is so important for the historian. The general strike of the union workers and the apocalyptic revolution of Marx are instances of such myths," unquote. So as adherents to social myths, both modern secessionist and historical Marxist constitute schismatic elements that can weaken and fracture the sovereign state. Marxist revolutionaries could not pinpoint the indeterminate juncture in history where the state would wither away, and likewise neo-Confederates and secessionists cannot pinpoint the indeterminate juncture in history where succession will end. Thus, the neo-Confederates and secessionists set into motion a perpetual series of successions guaranteeing continual disunity and the ongoing fragmentation of states, and eventually the state implodes, allowing for its easy assimilation by whatever supranational entities or foreign alliances hold sway. So when you hear knuckle-dragging idiots such as Chuck Baldwin and Alex Jones promoting the ideas of secessionism, you understand that secession contributes to the globalist strategy of regionalism, which they have been using and are continuing to use to bring about a new world order. So, to all of you Patriot members out there, Godspeed. You're doing a damn good job in tearing down the United States of America and basically setting up everything that you claim to hate. Well, with that being said, we'd like to thank everybody for listening. To check their sources, to do any sort of real research, and they latch a hold of any rumor, any innuendo that circulates within the Patriot community, and immediately present it as the gospel truth. But the fact that Olson's disinformation would actually help divert people's attentions away from Olshenrikio and its connections to criminalized portions of the intelligence community tells us that somebody was feeding this information to Olson for some, for nefarious reasons. Absolutely. And Olshenrikio is a very interesting case study. We'll probably touch on Shinrikyo and later installments of the Collins Brothers Unleashed. And we touch briefly on them in the book, The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship, and we are also going to be writing a little bit more about them in our forthcoming book, Invoking and Beyond, which heretofore there is no release date for that. We've kind of stopped setting dates for the completion of that work because it's so massive, and we want to give it the time and the attention that it deserves. And so instead of setting up some sort of arbitrary date for completion, we've decided that we're just going to complete it when all the information is in and all of the arrangement and the construction of the book is to our satisfaction. At any rate, returning to this discussion, while it is by no means monolithic, the militia movement is composed of enclaves of radical thought. Militia members tend to adhere to questionable belief systems, such as British Israelism. We have already touched upon British Israelism in our unfolding series over mystical imperialism. Those episodes are still available, and we urge the listeners to check them out. Go back and listen to them to contextualize some of the information that we're presenting you with in this installment of the Collins Bros Unleashed. We will also be discussing mystical imperialism in later installments of the Collins Bros Unleashed. We have yet to touch on German mystical imperialism and Russian mystic imperialism. The topic is a very expansive one, and we want to finish examining it in great depth. But at any rate, in a nutshell, British Israelism holds that Queen Victoria was descended from the biblical King David, and therefore was a member of the Davidic lineage that begat Jesus Christ. And proponents of British Israelism contend that the tribes of Israel migrated to Northern Europe and hold direct genealogical ties to the British. Thus, the British are actually God's chosen people, and the British Empire is the will of God being tangibly enacted on earth by the hand of man. So British Israelism qualifies as a form of Emanetist Gnosticism, as is evidenced by its mandate to draw the eschaton, that is, the end of days, into the ontological confines of the physical universe and establish heaven on earth, this time under the appellation of empire. According to researchers Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, John D. Olson has recently reemerged in Alaska trying to whip up basically fervor for the militia movement, trying to get Alaskans to form into militia groups. He's obviously trying to use basically the secessionist fever that was begun by the Alaskan Independence Party to basically whip up fervor for the militia movements, to basically swell the membership roster of the militia movement. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but is that the same Alaskan Independence Party that was addressed by Sarah Palin? That's correct. And Sarah Palin's husband was actually a registered member of the AIP for a time as well. Now, the AIP, they do in fact promote the seceding of Alaska, the extrication of Alaska from the Union, correct? That's correct. Okay. And I believe that basically they had gone about creating that kind of a secessionist climate in Alaska among some of the population, certainly not all Alaskans. Sure. And Olson was basically trying to exploit that. Yeah, exploit that, capitalize on that atmosphere, that environment. As I understand it, heretofore he's not been very successful, though. No. But at any rate, Olson's theory was laughable, to say the least, given the fact that Shinrikyo was the party responsible for the sarin gas attacks on the Tokyo subway. Now, there have been some tenuous ties established between the cult of Shinrikyo and KGB operatives. However, that's material for an entirely separate show. the breadth and width of which is quite expansive indeed. Well, parenthetically speaking, also Olson, his whole weird theory concerning the OKC bombing and basically that attack representing some kind of reprisal for the sarin gas attacks. It's a neat little piece of disinformation that would actually lead people away from Om Shinrikyo's bizarre and actually quite interesting and important connections to the intelligence community and to criminalized portions of the intelligence community. And so Olson was very much acting as a disinformation unit, a disinformation agent, quite in the same way that 9/11 truth misfits find themselves acting as disinformation agents today. Was he a conscious agent of disinformation? Probably not. In all likelihood, these people disseminate the garbage that they do quite in spite of themselves because they simply do not take the time to backtrack w.wisesserpents.com. And on his website, he recently dismantled the claims of a Chuck Baldwin article entitled, "Is Obama Really Preparing for Civil War?" Now, for the record, we don't necessarily subscribe to or promote the work of the gentleman who maintains www.wisesserpents.com. In some cases, this gentleman demonstrates a somewhat flawed understanding of deep politics and elite criminality. For instance, the gentleman occasionally portrays the global elite as monolithic, omnipotent, and unerring, a portrayal that is characteristic of sensationalism and conspiracy theory, and obviously even a cursory perusal of the literature over elite deviance does not support such a portrayal. The conspiracy is one of men, and as such exhibits all of the deficiencies and flaws inherent to the human condition. Now, that being said, the author of www.wisesserpents.com does an absolutely outstanding job of dismantling the dubious claims of Baldwin's article, and for that, we tip our hats to the gentleman and say congratulations. Well, published on December 11th, Baldwin's article contends that President Barack Obama has ordered U.S. Air Force General Gene Renard to immediately enlarge his military forces to 1 million soldiers by January 30th, 2010, in anticipation of another American Civil War, an eventuality that supposedly should manifest before winter comes to a close. Now, in support of this claim, Baldwin consistently cites a report from the European Union Times. Yet, as the author of wisesserpents.com makes clear, the European Union Times is not an actual newspaper. It is, in fact, a WordPress blog maintained by a female Florida resident. It is in no way affiliated with the European Union. And in turn, this blog links to American Resistance Radio, which is hosted by Jim Stekawiak. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, or Stekawiak. Stekawiak or Stekawiak. We'll go with Stekawiak. Stekawiak was the state director of the Georgia Civilian Militia from 1995 to 1997 as part of the National Confederation of Citizen Militias, or the NCCM, under Norman Olson. Many of the listeners will recognize Olson as the co-founder of the Michigan Militia. He co-founded that organization with Ray Southwell in 1994. However, this organization expelled Olson after the militia icon promoted a theory that the Oklahoma City bombing represented a violent reprisal by the Japanese government for the United States' alleged involvement in the March 20th, 1995 sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway. In truth, this attack was conducted by Om Shinrikyo, a Gnostic sect that was inspired by Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy. Parenthetically speaking, at this point, there are studies at the Council on Foreign Relations felt a need to comment on the poll's results. White elaborates, quote, It tells us that the president is sailing into a stiff wind, said James M. Lindsay, director of the studies at the Private Council of Foreign Relations. Unless he can produce obvious successes in Afghanistan and generally, he will find himself challenged, Lindsay said. Nearly half the public is worried the president is not tough enough in defending the interest of the United States generally, Lindsay said. Unquote. This article basically illustrates just how prophetic the words of elitist H.G. Wells has become. In his 1933 book entitled The Shape of Things to Come, Wells sees globalization occurring in 3 cycles. The first 2 cycles, according to Wells, would end with a breakdown in the globalization process and the failure of the first 2 embryonic world governments, the League of Nations and the United Nations. But Wells was quick to assure his readers that the third and final cycle of globalization would be successful, and that an enlightened population would embrace the idea of a world government. 12 years later, however, Wells was not so optimistic. As he approached the end of his life, Wells began to see some of the many flaws that are inherent to elite management of the world and realized that a world government was just not sustainable. Wells expressed his pessimism in his last book, the 1945 Mind at the End of Its Tethers. In that book, Wells wrote, quote, "Ours is a closed universe, yet we need something beyond it. Power is unsatisfactory," unquote. If power cannot provide salvation Wells seeks, then world government, which is the ultimate representation of worldly power, is most certainly unsatisfactory as a means of providing man with a worldly Messiah. But the deluded power elite have conveniently ignored Wells' final words concerning the New World Order. They refuse to believe any assessment that holds that a New World Order is not sustainable. And that includes the words of their own thinkers, such as Wells. The elite are going to continue attempting to construct a New World Order, the warnings of failure notwithstanding. If they do not tread carefully, globalism could receive a fatal blow shortly after this century's first decade. And if that happens, there may not be a revival of the globalist idea until this century closes. Now, on to this week's topic. Well, as Paul previously mentioned, we'll be citing from a critique by a gentleman who maintains the website www.wiseasserpents.com. And I'd like to apologize to that gentleman in advance because I did not catch his name, nor could I find it. But at any rate, heretofore we'll just refer to him as the gentleman or the author of the website www.
How y'all doing tonight? This is the Collins Brothers Unleashed. You have the ignorance, and then you have the all-consuming drama. Then you have the truth. And with that, to achieve it, you must turn to those who deliver it. I bid you and welcome you, the Collins Brothers Unleashed.
Hello, this is Paul and Philip Collins, welcoming you to another episode of the Collins Brothers Unleashed. This week we are going to explore the secessionist movement and how the call for disunion is being used by the power elite to undermine national sovereignty and to introduce a new world order. As part of this episode, we will be referring to an article at the website www.wiseasserpents.com, an article that dismantles a piece that was written by Chuck Baldwin. So we really recommend that the listeners go to that site and look at that piece to kind of lay the groundwork for what we're going to go into tonight. But first, we'll take a critical look at some of the recent developments in the news. A recent Associated Press article by Barry Schweid entitled "Poll: Isolationism Soars Among Americans" reveals just how unsuccessful the globalist power elite have been, as of late, in their attempts to condition the American public to reject national sovereignty and embrace the globalist concept of a one-world government. The December 3rd, 2009 article draws heavily from a poll conducted by the Pew Research Center. That poll, according to Schweid, found that a whopping 49% of Americans polled believe that America should, quote, mind its own business, unquote. Schweid informs us, quote, that's up 30% who said that in December 2002, unquote. Schweid also points out that the poll's findings, quote, appeared to conflict with President Barack Obama's activist foreign policy, including a newly announced buildup of 30,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan to fight Taliban and al-Qaeda extremists, unquote. According to Schweid, the poll shows the majority of Americans actually supporting the idea of a drawdown in Afghanistan. Schweid writes, quote, only 32% of the poll respondents favored increasing U.S. troops in Afghanistan, while 40% favored decreasing them, and fewer than half, or 46%, of those polled said it was somewhat or very likely that Afghanistan would be able to withstand the radicals' threats, unquote. Of course, the poll's results have drawn the attention of organizations that promote globalist ideas. One of those groups is the Council on Foreign Relations, an elite combine that is notorious for promoting globalist ideas. James N. Lindsay, the director